Jesus. So, I'm going to call the panel presenters down for the first panel. Just got to find my notes for that. Oh, where did I? Yeah, there it is. Okay, so we've got Catherine Broomfield from iHuman, Dr. Luann Keenan from the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry here at the U of A. We have Amelia Martin, Executive Director at the Centre for Public Legal Education, Alberta. We have Cynthia Puddu, who's an Assistant Professor at MacEwan University, and Dr. Jeannette Waegemakers Schiff, who is an Associate Professor in the Faculty of Social Work, University of Calgary, and their bios are in the program. So I'm going to take back one of those mics I just gave to our friends up there taking care of the webcast. I wish, I don't know, is there a nice background here? Oh yeah, there we go. There. Okay, so what we'll do, so we have about an hour, so a little bit less than an hour. I'd like to give everyone a bit of a break. So, there we go. That seems to be working. I'm actually going to, I thought there was one more chair for me. That's fine. Well, yes, perfect. So, what we'll do is we'll start, if everyone can just say a little bit about who they are and the research that they're engaged in, and then we'll get into some harder questions. Yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Catherine Broomfield. I'm the Executive Director of iHuman Youth Society, and I'm presenting today on behalf of a consortium of partners, and I'm just going to quickly read off the partners that are involved in this longitudinal project that we've been working on for a little over probably 6 years now. So. The members of that, and this is two different research projects that have been funded by Homeward Trust. Alberta Human Services, the High Risk Youth Initiative, Boyle Street Education Centre, the City of Edmonton's FCSS, the City of Edmonton Transit Services, and the City of Edmonton Bylaw Enforcement, Catholic Social Services, Edmonton John Howard Society, E4C, Edmonton Public Library, Homeward Trust, iHuman Youth Society, MAPS, Native Counseling Services of Alberta, Neighborhood Empowerment Team, Old Strathcona Youth Society, and the Youth Empowerment Support Services. And we've been working together to enhance the services that are available to the demographic of youth that engage in high-risk behaviors specifically. And it's, as I mentioned, it's a cumulative project, so this research has spawned each year to look at a different topic, but always around the demographic of the young people and including them as the co-researchers in the projects that we've done. And we are looking at mapping the youth's sense of safety, where they see places in the city that are safe and unsafe. We've looked at the barrier of transportation access. We've looked at, in this latest one, we're looking at banning and the practice and how that impacts the youth that all of our agencies are serving. And overall, that is to look at a sense of the youth's perceived sense of inclusion or exclusion in community. And the banning one is we're conducting an environmental scan of about 24 to 30 sites in Edmonton that the youth identified as places they are banned from or could expect to be banned from. We are talking to those sites or locations and trying to collect the data then on what is their actual banning process, because the perception of youth against the reality of the policy in those sites is sometimes very different. And we're looking at how that obviously impacts the youth's sense of being in community. And then the last part of the project, a separate research project that we're doing, but that links into this whole idea of the youth sense of inclusion, is around youth access. So we are looking at preventing or minimizing the engagement of the youth in the social justice system, or gaining access to services, perhaps employment, housing for sure, and what is impacting their inability to attain those goals, and transportation has been identified by them as a significant issue.
Great, thank you. Luann.
Hello, I'm Luann Keenan, and I actually have my office at the other end of this building on the same floor in the Division of Community Engagement. I'm the Director for Community Engaged Research with the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry, and I've also been on the board, the research board with Homeward Trust. So from my experience there and working with multicultural health brokers in Edmonton, the realization that newcomers have difficulty with housing. And I thought that was interesting, because if you think of a newcomer, you think of like, oh, welcome to Canada. But when we use the word immigrant, refugee, we don't have that same feeling as newcomer. Anyway, just when I heard you talking about that, Ron, I thought, oh, what a nicer way of saying welcome to Canada. Because what happens is the reality with working with the multicultural health brokers and working with Zenobia and Evelyn with Zenev Associates, what we're finding is that there are a lot of regulations that interfere with seniors, especially who are coming into Canada and do not have all the benefits. So with my economics background, recognizing that in the issues with income and for them for housing. So watching you this morning also and showing the stats and having economics background, I like the pictures better. So I like the pictures when that person was standing in front of all those buildings that weren't there anymore. So what we're doing, and I did this in Australia as well, was look at photo voice and use photo voice to actually capture the pictures of what is happening for these senior immigrants. That's why I had the privilege of working with multicultural health brokers, because they have a trusting relationship with those communities. I don't have that relationship with, like, they're with the Chinese Mandarin community, the Eastern European, like Ukrainian, Romanian, Bhutanese, the people from Nepal, Iraq, or Kurds, the Haiti and the Ivory Coast, Somalia, Ethiopians and Eritreans, and Central and South America. So, I mean, their scope of work with the low-income immigrant seniors, and the work that they're already doing with them, and the studies that they've already started to do, some quantitative research with them. But again, when you look at those numbers, it's not the same as them telling you, my family created a bedroom for me in the pantry or beside the washer and dryer. And so what I've been finding, and the reality is, it's very difficult to invade the privacy of their home, help them to understand that this isn't flaky research, and for them to see other research projects that have been valuable using photo voice and their narratives to tell the stories. So as we start to educate people on how to use a camera and how they could take a picture of something that was not going to ruin their relationship with the other people in their home, perhaps, or else confidentiality issues. So that takes a long time, like 6 months with ethics and having that relationship. But they're starting to tell us, just even piloting it, some of the issues that are coming forward. Thank you.
Great. Amelia?
I'm Amelia Martin. Can everyone hear me? No? Do I need to go closer? All right. I'm Amelia Martin. I'm the Executive Director at the Centre for Public Legal Education, Alberta, and we've been lucky enough to get 2 community research project grants through Homeward Trust. We've partnered with the University of Alberta Faculty of Extension for both of them, and both of them have revolved around the intersection between domestic violence and residential tenancies, so essentially rental housing in Alberta. So our first research project, we published the paper in June of 2014, so it's completed, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about it because it leads into the second research project that we're currently working on. So our first project was called The Hidden Homeless, Residential Tenancies, Issues of Victims of Domestic Violence, and we explored basically looking at whether the legal system was hindering or helping Albertans experiencing domestic violence in maintaining stable, secure rental housing. So we conducted interviews with stakeholder experts, we conducted focus groups as well as legal research, and perhaps not surprisingly, we found that the legal system was indeed hindering people's ability to maintain safe, secure, stable rental housing, as well as obtaining it, because we did find through the research there was a lot of discrimination for people who'd experienced domestic violence in terms of actually obtaining housing when they've left the situation involving violence. I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is going out. So a report was published in 2014, and it can be downloaded from our website. We outlined some of the key issues that hinder Albertans' ability to maintain housing, areas where further research is needed in this area, thank you, as well as recommendations, both legal and non-legal, to improve Albertans' ability to obtain and maintain safe rental housing. So one of the recommendations we did make through the original research project that we did was to better educate landlords about domestic violence from both a legal and a non-legal perspective. So really to inform them about the phenomena of domestic violence, what happens when a woman's going through the cycle of domestic violence, a woman or a man, I should say, as well as what they can do within the current legislative scheme to help tenants who've experienced domestic violence, as well as alerting them to some of their responsibilities under legislation like the Alberta Human Rights Act. So that's where the second community research project grant is taking us. So we're going to be identifying roles that landlords can play to support tenants who are experiencing domestic violence, as well as determining the legal information that landlords need to play such roles effectively. So what we're hoping to do is get landlords together so they can identify common scenarios that they encounter in situations that involve domestic violence. We can hear about what they think about domestic violence, and we're going to have a domestic violence expert sit in on the focus groups just so that that person can get a sense of where landlords are coming from, and then we can hopefully develop some strategies and some training materials so that we can not only sensitize landlords but also help better inform them about what they're able to do under the current residential tenancies legislation in Alberta. And in our second question, I'm going to talk about Bill 204, which is the new legislation that came out, which is the Safer Spaces Act for victims of domestic violence.
Thank you. Cynthia?
Hi, I'm Cynthia Puddu. I'm an assistant professor at MacEwan University, and I'm also a PhD candidate here at in the School of Public Health at the U of A. So my project is the one that's funded by Homeward Trust, is the first part of a larger project that I'm doing as part of my PhD. It's looking at, in general, youth experiences and resilience narrative of street-involved youth and homeless youth in the downtown area. But also, I want to look at how the redevelopment that is happening right now, I don't know if you've noticed, there's a big rink getting built. You might not have, but anyway, so there's a natural experiment happening right now. I'm going to be talking to the youth in the next few months about how the development that they're encountering right now is shaping their experiences and their resilience. But then also I'm really interested to see what's going to happen come September when everything starts to come alive and how their experiences may have changed. So I'm going to be talking to them sort of in those 2 points in time, but also just to get a general sense of what are the experiences of street-involved youth in downtown Edmonton. And I'm going to be using interviews and arts-based methods with the youth, so photo voice, different video technology, artwork, music, song, things, anything that speaks to youth that will help them create a narrative that helps us to understand what their lives are like. And I'm hoping to involve the youth throughout the entire process, so in the data collection, using participatory analysis, and also in the dissemination process to really have them involved from start to end of this project. Thank you.
And just to clarify with for Jeannette, Jeanette's project was actually funded through as a strategic research project. Homeward Trust and the Calgary Homeless Foundation were interested in. Well, I'll let her talk about the project, but very interested in what she was doing.
Thank you. So I've been trying to think of an image of how my research relates to everything else that you've been hearing about today. And I just realized that if you turn your camera around and take a selfie, that's what my research is about. Because it's looking at what are the psychosocial stressors of frontline workers who are working with homeless people. Now, why have we come here? Well, you know, 25 years ago, we hoped there wasn't a homeless problem, and then we realized there was. Now we have a problem that isn't going to go away any too quickly, but we also have developed this fairly significant group of people who dedicate themselves working frontline in all of the cities throughout Canada and the US. And how much do we know about them, and how much do we know about the kinds of stressors they're in? I was originally approached by, excuse me, the research department at the Calgary Homeless Foundation to see if I would help put together a study to look at psychosocial stressors and burnouts for frontline workers in the homeless sector. And that expanded to a conversation with Jerry, who said, this is a wonderful idea. So it became a two-city study. And I'm just at the tail end of analyzing the two-city data. But I have analyzed and turned in a report on the Calgary data and finalizing the data in Edmonton. So what we did is we went out to, in the two cities, in Edmonton we went out to 10 agencies, in Calgary another 13 agencies, so 23 altogether. And we had responses from over 480 workers. So what came out of the data, do I share that now? Or
Let's hang on to that one.
just say that
Question.
for later? It's really
Yes.
exciting, I'm telling you. Really, because everybody talks about how stressed out people get and how difficult this work is, but it's all anecdotal information. And do we need to know and be able to have some concrete information so we can move forward in helping to support the homeless frontline workers? So, all right, I've said enough.
All right, great. So I guess in part two, if you could tell a little bit about, so if you have already completed a portion of your project, or if this is perhaps the second time that you've received funding, if you can talk a little bit about, what were the results, or what are your not anticipated results, but what do you hope to achieve, and more importantly, how do you hope that it will impact policy and practice, or if you have some concrete examples of how it has, if you could share those, I think everyone would appreciate it.
Okay, so going back to the transit banning and social exclusion of youth, and I should have clarified that for our research, the youth, our definition of youth are young people that are between the ages of 12 to 24. So we do cross over into the young adulthood. I wanted to open the answer to this question with a statement from one of the youth, and I think it speaks to the issue of homelessness specifically. And that young person said, when you are homeless, you feel like an outsider. And I think what drives all of us that are part of the research that we're doing, and we're doing that from a very frontline perspective. All of us, for the most part, are not academics. We are frontline workers that see trends and gaps and the needs of the young people, and we have anecdotal information. We all know that this is the reality. And in order to demonstrate the need and hopefully impact policy, Mr. David French, we are collecting this data and trying to share it in a format that resonates with policymakers, and that is really the voice of the young people, the voice of the youth that we're serving. So in terms of maybe results that we've had, I think, you know, initially we just wanted to figure out where, as a collective in this committee, we wanted to figure out where do the youth feel safe and unsafe in the city of Edmonton. And from that, it spawned now 5 years worth of going back to them and saying, well, could you clarify this? Or you identified transportation as a barrier and an access issue, and that then led to being able to have City Council and Edmonton Transit say, okay, we hear you. Let's do a pilot now to look at if we gave the first one we did was funded by Homeward Trust, and we had 40 youth involved, either bus tickets or bus passes. Did that make an impact? It was only 3 months. We did it during the winter, because winter is when you need to find a safe place to stay warm if you're homeless. And from that, we were able to then get the City Council to support an ETS to support a bigger project, which is happening right now, 6 months, 100 bus passes each month, and being able to demonstrate that simple access to transportation really has profound impact on the quality of life of the youth, their access and their success, their engagement with programs, their engagement with making healthier choices, reducing their high-risk behaviors.
And so so that was your last project. So now for the new project that you're doing on bands, what do you hope?
I think what we hope to find, and as I said in the answer to the first question, the perception versus the reality of banning policies and practice from the youth's point of view is really what we want to capture. So we'll often hear the youth say, well, I'm banned from that place for life. They may have been told that. That may not be the reality. In fact, I think we're going to find that there's no place in Edmonton that says you're banned for life, although my brother did get a ban from West Edmonton Mall for a significant period of time. But anyway, totally different story. It involved the water and the dolphins and all of that. So many, many, many years ago, he probably would hate for me to have brought it up. But different, I mean, for my brother, he had a family that supported him. For a young person now, especially in Edmonton, many of the young people being Indigenous, that prejudice is almost an automatic ban. And that is just the reality of the experience of the young people that all of us are working with. And so I think from the information, we really want to understand the true nature of banning and how that impacts the youth. It is a punitive approach, and if we're wanting to have these young people be successful and not be encouraging their continued homelessness, then we need to look at ways to make them feel included, make them to feel safe, have people understand what put them there at 12 or 14 to be homeless, living in the River Valley. We see it. It's not a non-reality. That is the reality in our city. So by doing all of this research, we're hoping to inform you, inform policymakers, inform the citizens of Edmonton and elsewhere that this is the reality of what's happening in our community.
Great. Now, Luann, I mean, you've just, I guess, started the new project, looking with immigrant seniors. You are working with the multicultural health brokers, and I mean, from the research committee's perspective, we know so little about the housing needs of immigrants in general and seniors in particular. So, can you tell us a little bit about what sorts of impact you want to see from this project, you know, on policy or practice? What was the interest from multicultural health brokers in being involved, for example?
Thank you. Well, I think about the ignorance that I have in even talking about all the policies that are involved with the refugees and immigrants coming into Canada. And even when I sit down with Yvonne Chu or other people that are the experts on law, and they're like, well, we're not sure this week. So, but learning that, okay, how many people here are grandparents? How many people have grandparents? Okay. So think about, like for me, if my son says to me, you know, Mom, can you come and take care of the grandsons? Yeah, I'm going to go. But it's a different issue if I have to go to another country and I make that decision to go because culturally I want to go. I want to help my children, and I can go on a visa because I can't get in any other way because I'm 60 years old and maybe I can't contribute, like my income isn't that high. So the children that I'm going to go and help, they do not necessarily have the resources, but I mean, I come to Canada, say, and I am in a housing with my children who may actually even be in precarious housing themselves. But as a senior, I can only stay if I'm only on one of those extended visas as a, I can't remember what that one's called, but anyway, 10 years max, I can come and go. But then I can't come back after a certain amount of time. But my family has to pay for everything. And they have to pay for my medical bills, and it's pretty likely that as I'm getting older, that my health could fail. Also, what if I'm going with my daughter, and my daughter and son-in-law don't like each other anymore, and they don't really want grandma hanging around anymore? So that's a very precarious situation for me as the grandmother. Then where do I go? I don't want to put my daughter in a difficult position by ratting her out and saying that I'm vulnerable and my daughter's vulnerable and their marriage is vulnerable, and culturally it's a very delicate situation. So these are the types of things that we're talking about already. So these things have to do with issues like their fear of eviction and not understanding necessarily what they're signing. There's also stories about resilience and looking at seniors who are helping seniors. One will come over, like two grandmothers came over, one had employment and the other one didn't, and they just lived together, and they are creative in their ways of helping each other. But remember too that you may be coming to a culture that has a lot of people from your culture in Edmonton, but you may be from Bhutan, and there may only be a few people, so even from your church perspective. So the types of things, like when we say, they talk about things like the fear that their rent is going to go up, or where they're living with their children, that rent is going to go up, that they can pay the rent, but they can't pay the utilities, they can't pay any maintenance, they can't buy any furniture, and there's this mixed generation thing happening very often. There's no way for them to get income or increase their income. They're not getting any income from the government. There was some subsidies for them, now that's taken away. And so looking at those small amounts of money, like you say, that could help them. And then looking at their English, again, that's going to isolate them even further and make them more vulnerable. It affects their wellness. And then what you were talking about, abuse, that is also another issue, is hidden abuse, that they don't realize that originally they thought they would be able to continue to go to mosque or church or see people in their community, and they get more and more isolated. And so it may not be physical abuse, it may be financial or mental abuse.
Thanks. So Amelia, obviously you foreshadowed this earlier, so Bill 204, and if you could tell us a little bit more about that and some other policy impacts or practice impacts that you're looking for.
Sure. So in our first project report, Lois and Rochelle, who were the two principal researchers, had outlined 7 different recommendations that they'd made to essentially improve the situation of tenants who are experiencing domestic violence in terms of maintaining and obtaining safe rental housing. And One of those recommendations was for Alberta's residential tenancies legislation to be reformed to effectively respond to the needs of Albertans experiencing domestic violence. But in the report, we did indicate there's a lot more research that needs to be done. There's some other provinces that have done a few things here and there. MLA Deborah Drever, who's based in Calgary in 2015, caught wind of our report, read it, really wanted to do something to address the issues of victims of domestic violence in terms of amending the Residential Tenancies Act. So she introduced the Safer Spaces for Victims of Domestic Violence Act in November of 2015. It was passed through with record speed in December of 2015, and it's now currently waiting to come into force, and the people at Service Alberta are working to put together the regulations. I guess the one stickler that I wanted to talk about today is the fact that the legislation did come through so quickly that a lot of the key stakeholders weren't consulted when it was put together. So now the legislation, as good-hearted as it is actually causing a lot of concern, not only amongst landlords, but amongst those who are involved with the domestic violence sector. So what we're really hoping that we can do through this second project is, through working with landlords, actually be able to feed into the regulations to make sure that the legislation is something that's actually going to help people who've experienced domestic violence and not actually end up hindering them further. The way the legislation is right now, there's some concerns that it could cause more problems than it's going to help. So we're really hoping with the second project that through working with landlords and getting their perspective, they'll feel a little bit more ownership over the legislation, and that they will actually take it seriously and won't end up discriminating against people who've experienced domestic violence, which is kind of the concern right now with the bill as it currently stands. So that's one of the issues is you can go through and do all your research, but ultimately you don't have any power over what happens to it out there in the ether. So we are, this research ended up being very well timed. We got the research grant before the bill had come through, and now the bill's come through, and now we have the opportunity to do this. So I think it's perfectly timed, and the Centre for Public Legal Education Alberta and the University of Alberta both sit on the government's Alberta Residential Tenancies Advisory Committee. So we are there with Service Alberta, and we actually have the opportunity to feed directly into the regulations. So we're hoping that that will have a significant impact in how the bill ends up coming into force. So.
I'll have to say that whenever we see a report, or typically when you see a report that suggests legislative change, you kind of park those and say, okay, well, that's never going to happen. And so it's really interesting that the last research project that you did talk about legislative change, and hey, what do you know, it happened, and as you said, in record speed. But certainly there's some pros and cons with that. So no, Cynthia. Jay, are you still here? Jay, sure. Oh, there you are. Okay, hey. So, I think anybody who's been downtown or who's not been under a rock in Edmonton is aware, or Calgary for that matter, is well aware that we have a new arena coming up downtown. We also have considerable development in the core, and there have been concerns about displacement. Can you tell me, what, in terms of getting youth perspectives on development and its impact on them, how do you hope it will affect policy, the way policymakers or service providers change the way they do things, or even be influenced by it?
So some stuff I'm going to say is going to echo what Catherine said, even a quote from some of the youth that I talked to, because you made me think about, before I started on this project, someone I was working with said, you can't understand what it's like to be homeless unless you are homeless. And another person said, everybody has a story. And what I'm hoping to get is to give a face and a voice to some of the numbers that we saw earlier. We saw numbers up there, and they're like 20% and blah, blah, blah. So I'm hoping to give a voice and a face, because I'm hoping that some of the youth that we work with actually will not want to be anonymous and will actually want to see, and I think some of them will, and let the public understand who the people are that are being impacted by what is happening downtown, because I already hear rumblings of people that work downtown about what the encounters are going to be like, and oh, how horrible with the bums or whatever, right? And My hope is at the end of the first part of my project, which is collecting narratives, is to have an open forum where, and I think as a faculty member in a university that is downtown and that is also a key stakeholder, we have meetings with a lot of the stakeholders, and interestingly enough, a lot of the shelters and agencies that work with homeless people are never brought to those stakeholder meetings. And so I'm hoping that through my university contacts, we can sort of broker these conversations and bring youth to the table and bring youth to this forum to share their stories along with the public, along with other key stakeholders of the downtown arena. And again, I think part of what I'm going to do is going to go beyond just the impact of urban development. I can't imagine that it won't. And so bringing stakeholders to the table to understand just what is homelessness for youth in downtown Edmonton. And that second part of my research is actually doing an institutional and organizational analysis of how policies impact youth. And so I'm hoping to unearth how distal policies, like transit policies, in the long run impact youth, or jaywalking policies. I'm sure that when these policies were made, they weren't thinking that, oh, youth are going to end up in jail because they can't pay their jaywalking ticket, right? But that's what happens. And so I'm hoping that through the perspectives of the youth, then I can dig deeper into what are the policies that impact youth, to try and uncover how some policies that we might not even think about are impacting youth later on down the road. So that's sort of my hope. Hopefully I'll get there, we'll see. But yeah, that's it.
Okay, thanks. Now, Jeannette, what do you want to tell us about your project?
What would you like me to?
Oh, yeah, the 30 seconds you filled my ears with some very interesting information right before lunch. But
Well, first
you
of
know
all,
what?
I'd like all of you to know that this research has not been done anywhere that I can find in any search of the literature. So this is the first time that we're getting any feedback from frontline workers about what their workplace stress is. We also asked some information about the extent to which they're getting management and supervisory support. So this is the first time that we have an idea of what the supports and stressors are for people who are working frontline anywhere in the world, okay? And the database is large enough and it's spread across enough organizations and through 2 cities, thanks to the partnerships from Homeward Trust and the Calgary Homeless Foundation, that we're really able to make a very strong statement. The other thing is that we've been able, by some of the questions that we ask, to develop a profile of what the background of frontline workers is like. And we don't have that either. So a lot of stuff we've heard anecdotally about whether people have any preparation for this kind of work, what that preparation looks like, how much education they have, what their educational background is. So we've been able to develop that kind of profile. Okay, so without further ado, so let me go first of all to, we did 4 measures. We did measure of burnout, of vicarious traumatization, which is related to burnout. And vicarious traumatization is the idea that you develop traumatic symptoms from hearing the stories of people who've been traumatized. So it's not that you have been a witness to or been a victim of a trauma, but you're the second, you're hearing it secondhand. And that can create a vicarious traumatization. We also looked at compassion satisfaction, the extent to which workers report being feeling good, feeling satisfied, feeling worthwhile in the work that they're doing. And that's really important in this kind of work where, quite frankly, the pay itself is not going to keep you going. We also then did a separate measure of PTSD, and what we did was a very short measure that screened for PTSD symptoms with the understanding that 95% of the time, if you score beyond a certain cutoff, you will probably have a diagnosis of PTSD. So, burnout in Edmonton is around 24% of the workforce. is burned out as they were filling this out. Now, somebody asked me earlier on whether we did this before or after the economic downturn. It was just before the economic downturn. So we're not talking about any influences of our current economy. So that is almost a quarter of the workforce at any given period of time is burned out to the extent that they should probably be stepping back from the front line. We're not talking about average burnout, we're talking about serious burnout. More importantly, or equally importantly, is the fact that the report of people with PTSD symptoms that are of a clinically significant level runs over 30%. In Calgary, it's closer to 35%. Statistically, there's not much difference between the two cities from a statistical significance point of view. What that means is that almost a third of the workforce is actively experiencing serious symptoms of PTSD, enough that they'd probably qualify for a diagnosis at any given point in time. These are our frontline workers. We've got a huge, huge problem in trying to support people who are trying to support very vulnerable people. To give you a perspective on it, the PTSD symptoms are higher than they are for veterans returning from combat. They're about double that are reported by police and firefighters and other research studies. So this is really significant. It raises the issue of what do we do? But first of all, we have to look at the fact that we've got a workforce that is in really hurting, okay? And now we have the evidence. And it's not a small-scale study, and it's got huge statistical significance on it, okay? I made sure I used really good, reliable scales so that there was no question that what we were going to get were some really good, reliable answers. So that's the part of my message. What are the implications? The implications, I think, are really pretty important for the funders, both at a local and at a provincial level, to provide some supports for this workforce. There's no question about the fact that all of you who are working frontline are doing absolutely valuable, important work, but you can't keep on bailing out a bucket, out this huge pond with a bucket that's got leaky holes in it at the same time. And I don't mean that in any negative sense of the word. I'm talking about the fact that there are a lot of people out there that need help, and they need some training and education around how to identify when there are symptoms, either themselves or others. They need some help in identifying what are the ways in which they can reduce those symptoms, and the ways in which the workplace can be made a safer environment. Because right now, a lot of people are working in a very unsafe environment from a psychological point of view. Anyway, I could go on and on and on, but I'm really passionate about this, and I think it's a pretty significant study. So.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think all five, and there's actually a sixth that's talked about in your program, or sorry, listed on the back of your program. So as you can see, I mean, we're talking about, in terms of funding, pretty small scale projects. I mean, our community-based research projects are, maximum $20,000. Jeannette's project, the Edmonton portion was, under 10. But I think it's important to recognize that this community engaged approach to research actually could have some pretty significant impacts. You don't need multi-million-dollar studies in order to actually affect change. So with that, I know there's another question in here about challenges and opportunities with community engaged research, but I think we've probably whetted the appetite a little bit in the audience, and there's probably some burning questions out there. So if everyone's okay with it, I'm just going to open it up very quickly. Sure.
I'm sorry, I always got to add one thing. This is really important, though, because I don't know who the agencies were in Edmonton. I mean, my research associate knows, but I don't have the names of them. All we did was we gave agencies a code number in the data set. I want you to know that the information I reported goes across all agencies, and there's no difference among agencies. So no, we're not talking about it being in one area or the other. Okay, we're talking about it being all over the place. And I really wanted to make that point so that we know that this is a universal issue.
Thank you for that. Questions?
Just quickly, how does my agency get involved with your research?
That's
For all of you.
What is your agency?
My name is Shannon Beaverbones. I'm a senior manager for an off-reserve Aboriginal housing program. I've been a frontline worker since 2008, and this is like really, really good, valuable information for me. My chief and counselor are actually the forefront of like policy making, and it would be really beneficial for my leadership to like get involved with like what you guys are like trying to do. I think it's amazing because, you know, a lot of the challenges that you guys were discussing, we're struggling to even understand within our own community. So I would like to get involved.
Well, this is the place to start that.
So how do I sign up?
Yeah,
Sign me up.
Yeah, please. So after, like, we're going to have a quick break after this, so I would encourage people here at the table to meet with you. Beverly, you'll be connecting with them? Yes. Great. Perfect. That's what I'd love to hear. That's what this is all about. Question over there?
Hi. Sorry, this question is for Dr. Jeannette. Hi. I was wondering, did you find any correlation between amount of time spent working, the number of years spent in the front line, and the PTSD or burnout?
So, okay, I'm going to get into the details. The jury is going to be going, Jeannette, you've run out of time. First of all, we found out that 49% of our respondents had been working for 2 years or less. The length of time that someone was working within the homeless system was mildly, but not largely, it was significant, but a small correlation with the burnout, okay? And I think we need to have conversations about why this is taking place. Because this isn't just about what happens within work, but it is what happens within work. So, and because this is new research, we're going to need a lot of conversation about what people think may be going on. And it'll probably lead to other research, but anyway. Yeah, does that help? Okay.
Hello, my question is for Amelia. Can you talk about some of the strategies, if there are in place, with landlords and the training that will look like? And also, should it fall on Housing First workers to be the ones to educate landlords if the Safe Spaces Act has been passed? If there's strategies in place in regards to training and educating landlords and what that will look like?
Yeah, I can't speak much to it now because we're only in the very beginning stage of the project. Because this is such a small grant, you know, we're going to do essentially a pilot training and develop some strategies that hopefully we'll get funding for to continue on down the road. The Centre for Public Legal Education does a lot of landlord training through one of our other projects, so it may end up that we're able to do that through this specific project. But, you know, what we're really hoping is that we are going to be able to develop a, you know, say 2-hour workshop where landlords can come in. The issue is always reaching the landlords that most need to be reached. That tends to be the biggest challenge, is the landlords that are maybe acting in a discriminatory way against people who've experienced domestic violence aren't the ones who are going to come to our workshops. So trying to reach them continues to be the challenge, and we have a fairly strong partnership with the Alberta Residential Landlord Association as well as the Calgary equivalent. So, you know, we try to work with them as much as we can in terms of reaching out to landlords. So we'll know more in a few months once we've had the initial meetings. So, yeah.
Any other questions out there? Oh, David, middle.
This is a question for Jeannette. Did you find any correlation between, or perhaps you didn't ask the question, around people with lived experience and their ability to work in the sector and maybe operate better given their experiences or previous experiences?
We actually didn't ask that question. So we asked about 100 questions, and trying to just crunch the numbers down in terms of what are the, the really important variables. I'm still playing with some of the data. What I've done now, because I had to do originally a report for Calgary, then a report for Edmonton, and then pull the two databases together and say there's really not much statistically significant difference between the cities. So what we're really saying is this is within the sector, not within a city or within particular agencies. And now we have to look at, are there any variables that are really out there that are, calling to us and saying these are strong predictors? Haven't found any so far. Found a few things that suggest that supervisory and managerial support helps to mitigate, to lessen the extent of the burnout and the PTSD. It comes as no surprise. The problem with that is that most people in the sector have not received any training. And they don't, whether they're frontline or whether they're management. So most managers and supervisors just learned as they were doing, which doesn't necessarily give them all of the skills that they need in order to do their jobs best either. So you might want to know that 49% of frontline workers have 2 years post-secondary or less. That we could not find anyone in Edmonton who indicated that they had any training in addictions or were working as an addictions counselor. That to me is unfathomable in an area where we know a lot of people have addictions issues. Okay, so.
Maybe at the agencies you went that you
use the mic.
did the research at.
Catherine, use the mic.
We did.
Sorry, I was just in response to the no staff in Edmonton with addictions training at agencies, but that would be the agencies that were part of that research project.
We had at least one addictions treatment center as part of it. So, which is surprising. So I'm talking about educational background. I'm not talking about on-the-job training. I am talking about educational background because we did not ask about on-the-job training.
You're saying at a management level or at a frontline worker level?
So
we had some managers respond. Oh, okay, we can.
Yeah. You know what? There are lots of, and remember that this was a very small-scale project. Basically, we went through the Edmonton Coalition on Housing and Homelessness to recruit agencies as well as our Housing First agencies. Not by far, not a comprehensive. Like we didn't include every agency, but I think. Based on what Jeannette's saying, I mean, it's a pretty significant or pretty substantial sample, right? And probably cause for more research. I have another question in the middle here.
Hi, this question is kind of sort of a question and a statement for yourself, Jeannette. I just wanted to mention that when it comes to working with individuals frontline, I'm finding, as someone who's been doing this for almost 8 years now between Ontario and Alberta, a lot of non-for-profits don't have funding for benefits or any other supports for the workers. So a lot of the supports want to be just scratching the surface. So you do like a day retreat or you can talk to your supervisor, but is there a way that you could publish your data to look at funding for us to get proper counseling for ourselves, us with lived experience, our own personal traumas, adding on to the PTSD and other issues? I mean, we need to seek out supports, and I personally see a counselor for $180 an hour. That's not really feasible on our income. So it's this catch-22, right?
Yeah, you're right. And my first responsibility is after I've made sure that the formal reports are completed and turned into Homeward Trust, and the Homeless Foundation is then to get a journal article or two out so that it gets wider dissemination, but also to beat the bandwagon provincially and federally about the need to recognize that that there is this workforce that also needs training and support in order to effectively do its job.
I actually have a question for Dr. Luann, especially because right now I'm working on a project that focuses on facing discrimination as an immigrant in housing. So I was wondering if you had any kind of feedback within the scope of your project about, especially because age is not a protected ground under the Alberta Human Rights Act, and especially because you're looking at an intersection of vulnerable populations. I was wondering if you had any feedback about the discrimination aspect, if people are experiencing it from their landlords, and if that's having an impact on their vulnerability, I guess. Sorry.
Thanks. One of the issues about discrimination, and this could, some of them are very sensitive about saying it was because of who I am, and explaining it that they couldn't read the documents well enough, so they didn't know there was this fine print, or that they didn't understand that they were expected to pay the utilities, whatever it was, and then, so the discrimination is that they couldn't understand the contract that they were in, or just their great fears that where they lived before or where they came from before, they would be evicted for certain issues, and that may not be the case here, but they don't even know who to ask, or they don't know who to ask to advocate for them. And so I think language, it is a big barrier for them, because when we're looking at low-income immigrant seniors, it could be the same kind of discrimination for mid to high-income immigrant seniors. But the big issue that we find, the discrimination, is more to do with communication, and they didn't have the income, so they were not identifying initially. Sometimes it's a bit of a fear to say that. And it's also the trust. That's why also we're using the multicultural health brokers, because they have that trust, and they can get a broader comfort level than me going and asking them, because that might be more threatening to them. That's why I'm not the one who's asking. The people who are asking are usually asking them in their own language, which I think will give us richer data, but I don't have all the data yet.
Great. And I'm going to take the last question, since there are no other takers. So for Catherine and Cynthia, I mean, there's obviously some connections between the work that you're doing and your projects. How do you see in an ideal world, how do you see the results of your project, or the conclusions of your projects informing either city administration or the provincial government to change the way that youth are heard in policy decisions or in decisions that affect their environments?
Whether this will happen or not, I don't know. But what I would like to see is more of a youth perspective at the table when it comes to policy. In fact, one of the things that I've heard from youth is, and youth workers, is we never see those suits down here. They don't know what the heck our lives are like, right? Yet they're making decisions about our lives. And so to find a way, and whether it's through researchers or ideally empowering youth to be at the table with policymakers, would be amazing. Again, whether that is going to happen in a year, 5 years, 10 years, I don't know, but that's sort of what I would like to see and aspire to, is just that youth voice at the table with people that make decisions that impact youth.
Ditto.
Well said, and good eye on the clock there. So I just want to say thank you to all of our panel presenters.